Good Monday morning. Welcome to the beginning of the Word. Today we'll be studying 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you is not in vain. But even as we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. Paul comes back to the mindset and returns to the situation around him being there. He says, for you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. So this coming here is what he's going to refer back to, that time that they spent there, which accords with Acts chapter 17. He wants to return to that and reflect on that and what they would experience. And as we mentioned in previous studies in this series, I would suggest that he's ensuring they have a common understanding of his time there and what happened, to preempt or to address existent claims about his behavior, because they had to leave quickly, and he wants to set the record straight. So if anyone tries to come behind and undermine his work, that can't happen because everybody knows what's going on. And so he's addressing that the effect of his work is only explained by the power of God, and that his conduct was wholesome and in accord with the way a person should behave. He was morally upright in what he did. It says, you yourselves, rather, know that our coming to you was not in vain. That is, it was effective. It had an effect. You saw a spiritual result that come about it. Now he's going to give some context for their coming. He says, even after we had suffered and were spitefully treated at Philippi. Now this is a reference back to Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas had experienced being in prison. There's really a great similarity in what happens in Philippi and Thessalonica in a general sense, that Paul and Silas had endured a beating and an imprisonment, and ultimately, as they're singing praises to God, there's an earthquake and the jails burst open, and they convert the jailer there, and then they're able to get back in front of the legal authorities and use their citizenship to get out of the situation. But after this, the church company quickly whisks them out of town. And as I mentioned, there's an analogy here between the Philippian and Thessalonian situations, that they're very, very mirror in that they have initial success until attracting a little too much attention from the city more generally, that results in them having to leave town because of what's going on. It says, so we were spitefully treated at Philippi. We had a bad time, and you know that. We just came from there. We told you about it. But we were what? We were bold. We were bold. Where? In our God. We were bold in our God to do what? To speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. In spite of what happened, Paul and his company were bold. They were emphatic in their declaration of the word of God. They didn't let the fact that they had been spitefully treated and abused and imprisoned and beaten get them down and depressed and say, oh, we should just give up on this. It isn't working. Instead, they had a remarkable boldness in their declaration. But it's important to see here, this boldness was not in them, but it was in God. The boldness and the confidence was in the Lord, who was the surety of that, because I would say fundamentally, if you go back to the previous chapter, that he raised Christ from the dead, that Christ has been raised from the dead, and so God is the one who has solved all the world's problems historically in that resurrection to some degree, and so we could be confident to declare that. Now notice, they speak this with boldness. It's like they get spitefully treated at Philippi, and they're bold. They don't let that get them down, and so they say, let's go to Thessalonica. But it's important to see that they didn't just leave Philippi holding on to the hope of, I'm sure it'll be better in Thessalonica. I'm sure it'll be fine. They went for that opportunity, but it doesn't seem that there was some naive hope that it was all going to work out and be different. Instead, they went because of the gospel. They went because of God's charge to them to go. Because if they had gone with that attitude, they would have perhaps given up. They would have gotten to Thessalonica and said, this is exactly as in Philippi, and it reinforces the notion that it should be easy. But because the boldness is in God and in his power, they could be spitefully treated at Philippi, but then they can speak the word of God in much conflict. They can go right through the same thing again because they know they aren't going for themselves, but they're going for the God in whom their boldness is placed. And he considers that. He says, for our exhortation did not come. It didn't come from what? From error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit. Now he's speaking about the time they were there and what it was like and what they experienced. And now he's talking about the motivation for here. What does this have to do that they were bold in God to speak the truth in much conflict? Because the conflict demonstrates their sincerity. He's saying our exhortation here is in sincerity. It didn't come from error, uncleanness, or deceit. It wasn't out of something that doesn't align with God's will. It doesn't align with fleshliness. It's not about trying to lie or dupe people into thinking something that's not true. Because if their aims were selfish or exploitative, they would have stopped, because who's going to keep going into conflict for selfish aims like that? If they were trying to be deceitful or fool people or make a quick buck, they would have stopped and actually gone somewhere where it would have worked. But the fact that they were there in that conflict shows the truth of what they were saying, and it shows their dedication to it. He says, but as we've been approved by God, it wasn't in error, uncleanness, or deceit, but they've been approved by God to be entrusted, a powerful word. God's given them the gospel, and so we speak. Because God's given to us, we've got to speak it. Instead of running and trying to do this for their own motives and do it where it's easy, God's entrusted them with the ministry. God has selected and approved them, and as such, they have this divine responsibility to speak regardless of the fallout. They just don't have the choice to speak or not speak, because that call and that charge isn't from them. And when it comes to the manner, he says not speaking as pleasing men, but God. And what does God do? He tests our hearts. God can see our hearts. We're not going to speak out of error, uncleanness, or deceit, but God tests our hearts. We're going to speak with purity of motive. They don't speak to please people. They don't speak with favoritism or selfishness or partiality or out of a desire to tell people what they want to hear, he'll go on to say in our next study. Instead, they're going to have to answer for the way they handled the word of God, the God who is going to come in wrath on those who disobey. And so they're going to speak what's entrusted to them, and they speak with his boldness, with his confidence that he's going to make all things right at the day of Christ. The fact that they suffer such things, as we've mentioned, is a testament to the validity of their message and their sincerity before God. Because if there's any duplicity in their hearts, if they were coming along and trying to do this for some ulterior motive, they certainly would have directed their efforts to something much less self-destructed. And so this teaches us about the need to speak boldly and to speak with sincerity, because whenever God is on our side and we speak with boldness in our God, we're able to overcome conflict and spiteful mistreatment, because we've been entrusted with the truth of the gospel of God who tests our hearts. Thank you for joining us today here at Begin in the Word. It's our prayer that just as you begun today in the Word of God, you live out today in the Word of God.